friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card combining a few Hello Bluebird sets, including Word Buddies Woodland, Pig Out, Woodland Littles, and McGregor's Garden. So I've stamped my images out in Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock, and I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm going to start with my two foxes, and I'm going to use my favorite combo for foxes, which is YR12, YR14, and YR18. So I prefer to color darkest to lightest, so I'm using my YR18 first to lay in some shadows. Since this guy is mostly facing forward, I'm going to put the shadows equal on the left and the right, and then I also put a little shadow above his tail where that would be casting a shadow on his body. Then I'm going to take the YR14, which I'm using for my midtone, and blend out the YR18. And then finally I'll come in with my highlight shade, which is the YR12, and fill in all of the rest of the area that I want to be orange. Then I'm going to move on to my second fox, and I'm going to color him exactly the same with the shadows on equal sides, since he's also facing forward, and also that little shadow above the tail. And I will be doing a second layer of coloring off screen for each of the critters, since they are the larger images. Those are the ones that I really wanted to make sure I had a smooth blend on, and also to just increase the saturation of those markers. So I just go over the critters exactly like I have, but it's even quicker because the colors are already mapped out on that first layer. For the whites of the foxes, I'm going to use E50 and E51, just adding a little bit of shading on the edges with that E51 on the face and the chest and the tail. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E50, and I'm going to let that fade into the white. So just a touch of that to soften the E51. And then I'm going to move on to my squirrels. And for them, I'm going to use a whole bunch of colors because I want to have a lighter belly and face. So I'm using E11, E13, E15, E17, and E19. So I'm doing red squirrels because those are my favorite, one of my absolute favorite animals of all time. So I'm starting with that E19 and doing my shadows on this little guy, and just making sure I also get a nice shadow in the curve of the tail so it looks really nice and fluffy when it's all done. I also added a little shadow over the bridge of the nose just to create a little extra contrast right there. And then I'm blending out with the E17. Then I'm going to use the E15 and pull that color toward the center of the forehead and also up on the belly and higher on the tail as well. I'm trying to just create those areas of highlight where the sun would be hitting the most. And then I'll move on to the E13 and I'll finish off all of the highlighted areas on the head and tail. I'm also going to bring up that belly area and add a little shading around the outer edges of the face. And then I'll finish up the face with the E11. And then I'll go back and add a little shading with the E13 and finish with the E11 for the feet. And that blend isn't real perfect on his tail especially, but that's what the second layer is going to help smooth out. So when you see me move on from these squirrels, you'll be able to see that there is a nicer blend on there. So this little squirrel I'm doing a bit differently since he's facing toward the left. I'm doing his shadows mainly down the right side of his body, leaving the highlight on his facial features, and using the same color combos as the first little guy. I also wanted to mention that I did stamp a few images of some berries and leaves in some colored inks. Those images are all from the Woodland Littles stamp set, and I stamped them in Lawn Fawn inks. I used Sunflower for the yellow berries, Forget-Me-Not for the blueberries, and then Jalapeno for the lighter green leaves, and Noble Fir for the darker green leaves. So just wanted to have a little extra accessory images that I could kind of fill in my scene with later on. So next I'm going to do the raccoons, and I'm going to do those in some warm grays. I'm using W00, W1, W3, W5, and W7, and again I'm using 5 shades because I'm going to do 2 contrasting areas on their bodies. So for the parts that are the lighter gray, which is the majority, I am starting with W3 as my darkest and laying in my shadows with that. So I'm doing them on the left side for this first little guy since he's facing toward the right, and blending out with the W1 as my mid-tone. I also left the belly area completely blank for now because I want that to be even lighter. And then I'm also doing the tail, just skipping every other stripe. So I'm using W00 to fill in the highlighted areas, and I'll also color in the belly with that shade and finish off the stripes. I did forget to do the belly on this first little guy the first time, but I caught him on the second layer. So for the second little guy, since he's facing toward the left, I did his shadows on the right. I'm going to have a central light source, so all of the critters will have the light on their faces if they're facing one way or another. So I'm just going to do this little guy with the same exact shades. And honestly, there are so many absolutely sweet little woodland critters in this stamp set. You could have used any combination of these. If you prefer, the bunnies or the bears or, any of the other critters, you could create a similar card, just replacing whatever critter that you decide, you would rather have with one of these guys. So for the darker areas of the body, I'm using W7 as my darkest, W5 as the mid-tone, and then W3 as the highlight. So the darkest on the body becomes the lightest on the darker parts. And making sure to use that lightest shade over the eyes so that they're still really prominent and visible. Before I put that W7 away, I'm going to use that to color in the nose of my little squirrel. And then I'm going to give all of my critters some rosy cheeks using R11 and R20. And I'm also going to color in the insides of the ears. So for the fox, I only used the R20 since they were already pretty much filled in. And same with the squirrels, but I am going to squeeze in some R11 on the raccoons. And then for the rosy cheeks, I'm just taking that R20 and doing a little oval shape on each cheek. And then I'm going to trace around the edges of that with the R11, and that just softens up that color and helps it kind of melt into the background shade of their fur. So I wanted to have a pop of red on the card in at least 2 places. So I'm going to take this little peach from Pig Out and turn that into an apple. I'm using R22, R24, and R29. And I'm also coloring in the little mushroom from McGregor's Garden at the same time. So I'm going to just color carefully around the little white dots for that. And then for the apple, just to make it look a little more realistic, I'm going to add a touch of green on there with YG01, and then I'll color in the leaves with that shade, and also add a bit of YG03 at the base of each leaf for a little bit of extra contrast. And I'm going to do the grasses for the flowers above with those 2 shades as well. And then for the flowers, I wanted something that looked like forget-me-nots, so I'm using B41 and B45. Just put the darkest down at the bottom and the light at the top. And then for the centers, I'm going to grab a Y15 marker and just dot that in. For the tiny acorn, which is from Woodland Littles, I'm going to use E51 and E53 for the bottom part, and I'm going to color in the mushroom stem with these shades as well. Started with the E53, blended out with the E51, and then I went back and added a bit extra of the E53. And then for the top of the acorn, I used E57. I dotted that into each little scallop and blended out with the E55. For the 3 stamped leaves, I'm going to use G40, G43, and G46. So I'm starting with the G46 and adding a little line of shadow into the crease that's already drawn in, and also just accentuating the bottom edge of each little part of the leaf, each little scallop. And then I'm going to blend that out with the G43 and save a little bit of room in there for that highlight shade, the G40, which is going to really lighten things up. And then once I finish with the coloring, I'm going to take a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen. I'm going to scribble it off to the side because I like to get it started so that the ink is flowing nicely. And then I'm going to dot that over the eyes of my critters. That just makes them nice and bright and shiny, really brings them back to life, really makes a difference on those raccoons that have the darker area. And then I'll trim all the images out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm going to take the Gallery Frame 6 die from Hello Bluebird and lay that down over a piece of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock, and then I'll use a pencil to trace the openings on that just lightly because I want to create 3 separate little scenes on this card front, so I need to ink blend each one of them separately. And then as I start each one, I'm going to erase the top pencil line so that it's no longer there because it would get trapped underneath the ink. I just need to use it as a guide for each section, so I'll erase each one as I go. Then I'm using the MFT Rolling Clouds stencil and some tumbled glass Distress Oxide ink, and I'm going to create a little bit of a sky. And then I'll move down to the second panel. I also just added a bit of blue under there so that they weren't so stark white. And then I'm going to blend my second little window. And I'm making sure to turn that stencil each time so I get a different variation of clouds in the background. So then I'll go and line up my third one, erase those pencil lines, and then go ahead and ink blend my tumbled glass on there one more time. Then I'm going to press a little of that ink onto my work surface and water that down and pick that up with a thin paintbrush. And I'm going to do some splatter detail in the background just to add a little bit extra interest and movement, and it's just something that I really like to do. I gave that panel a little bit of time to dry, and now I'm going to start erasing the bottom lines. I'm leaving enough of a line there that it's still visible to myself so that I can see where it was supposed to be, but you know, I just don't want it to be obvious in the final card that you see any of that. So for this, I'm going to use the MFT Drifts and Hills stencil and some Mowed Lawn Distress Oxide ink. So I'm just going to blend that down starting on the stencil and then kind of lifting up as I get lower so I get a higher concentration of ink at the top edge of that hill. And just as I did with the other stencil, I'm going to continue to rotate it so I get a different variation of hills in the background for each little scene. Now, I didn't let the ink dry as long as I should have for that splatter detail, so I did get a bit of smearing in the background, but I just took a baby wipe and kind of wiped that up and removed ink in any places that I didn't want it to be. And then I pop that in my Misty, and I'm going to stamp my sentiment in VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I'm using the one that says Hello Friend, which is from McGregor's Garden. And I stamped that down twice to make sure I had a nice impression. And then I'm going to pop my card base in my Misty. This is a piece of craft cardstock from Lawn Fawn. And I'm going to stamp on the inside in Lawn Fawn Walnut ink. And for the inside, I decided to go with the two little bears. Between them, I added a little strawberry, and then the flowers on the outside are also from Pig Out. And then the sentiment, You Warm My Heart, is from the Woodland Littles stamp set. So the pattern paper I'm using is from the Echo Park A Slice of Summer 6x6 collection. And I already had the inner piece here that I used the outer part for on a different card, so I thought today would be the perfect time to use that scrap. So I just need to flip through and figure out what print I want to use for the outer part of the frame. I was going back and forth between a few of them, including this navy blue print. There was a green polka dot print and also a red and white plaid that kind of reminded me of a picnic blanket. But I decided to save that one for a different card. I thought that might be too much vibrant color on the card. So I ended up going with the green polka dot. So I'm going to trim this out with that Gallery Frame 6 die. And I'm going to be left with the inner piece once again, so I'll save that for another card and replace that with the floral print. I'm going to flip these over to the back side and tape them together with a little bit of Scotch tape. And I'm just tearing that tape in half. It was too wide for the pieces, so I tore it in half and just made sure that I covered up the seams so I could use one strip for the top and the bottom. And it didn't have to be perfect. All I wanted was to hold these two pieces together so that I could add some foam tape to the back of them and use them as one complete layer. So I added that tape to the four sides that just bridged the gap between those two different pieces of pattern paper. And then I added the foam tape to the back. I also popped up the little strips in the center so that those would be well supported. And then I'm going to peel off those release papers, just tossing the papers into my little Twiddler's Nook embellishment tray so that I can take that whole thing to the garbage can later on. And then I'm going to line that up over the background. I did trim that background down a bit so it would fit nicely behind that frame. And then I will take a little bit of Barely Art craft glue and add that to the back. Line it up with the four sides of my card front so that it is nice and straight, and press that firmly into place. So then I'll bring in my images, and I've added some foam tape to the backs of all of my critters so that they can be popped up and have some dimension as well. So I'm going to start in the top window, and that is where I'm going to place my two little foxes. And I'm going to add this second sleeping one so that her body is kind of accenting that sentiment. Then I'm going to move down to my second frame, and that is where I'm going to add my squirrels. So I'm going to place this one with his hands up to his mouth over on the left, and then I'll use the other squirrel on the right, and I'm going to add the tiny little acorn into her hand. In the third window, I'm going to add my two raccoons, And I'm staggering each set of critters slightly differently so that they're not all just lined up straight over top of each other. So the foxes are shifted a little more toward the left, the squirrels are a bit more centered, and then the raccoons I'm shifting a bit more toward the right. And then I'm going to add the little apple into the left one's hands. So all the rest of the images I'm going to adhere with liquid glue. So I'm going to just add the flowers up to the center section with the squirrels. This one I just had to tuck slightly behind the squirrel's tail. And then I'll add another one over on the left side to balance that out. Then next to the foxes, I'm going to take some of the different leaves. I'm going to use the ones that I colored and also the ones that I stamped in colored ink and try to make like a little cluster there. I'm using the tips of my scissors to position some of these images just because they were already out and handy from cutting down my foam tapes. So I'm adding a leaf on the left and the right for the top one, and then I'll add a tiny little cluster of yellow berries over on the right, and I'm going to top that little cluster off with the bright red mushroom, which is going to tie in to the red apple down at the bottom, but also the apples on the left and the mushrooms on the right, so that also just creates a little extra balance there. So just making sure I have that mushroom positioned right. And then I'll take the larger blueberries and add that over on the left hand side. And then for the raccoons, I'm going to take some of these larger leaves and add those down first, the ones that are stamped in the colored ink. I'm going to also add the cluster of yellow berries, again putting that over on the left hand side since the yellow berries at the top are on the right. Then I'll add one of my Copic colored leaves. It's my last little leaf, and just tuck the stem below the frame so it looks a little bit more seamless. And then these last two little pieces, the green leaf and the small blueberries, are going to get tucked over on the right hand side. As a finishing touch, I'm going to add a little Stardust Stickles, but I didn't want to overdo it, so I just added it to a few little places. I did it on the 3 Copic colored leaves, on the mushroom, on the centers of the flowers, and the cap of the acorn, and also on the apple. So I'm going to lift that up to the camera so you can see how that sparkles and shines. It just adds another little extra bit of definition to the card. And then there is another peek at the inside. I had such a blast playing with these adorable woodland critters. I just want to make cards using all of them. I think they're so sweet. So if you enjoyed it too, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. If you're interested in any of the products I used, you'll find them listed and linked in the description bar below. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought might also interest you. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day. Bye-bye.